actually let some of the personality of people it's got
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As a local of the city, I welcome you, all you who have travelled very, very long distances to be here. I came to this city in 1964, and I've not left. I live in a small village called Wheelock, which is down the road. It is a great honour to have Sir Hilary Beckles with us today. In fact, I'll just wait till It's a great honour to have Sir Hilary Beckles with us this evening to give us a special lecture, which is entitled Britain's Black Debt. Sir Hilary is Principal and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies Barbados campus. Since, in fact, I received an honorary degree from the University of the West Indies last Saturday, and when I looked at the I couldn't travel to Jamaica for health reasons, so at my university at Wheelock, we set up a link with the University of the West Indies, and I could see him sitting on the platform. So now as a graduate of the University of the West Indies, I therefore have to feel I have to behave myself. So Hilary holds many senior and distinguished positions in it's not the vice chancellor. That came off the Edinburgh University information. So Hilary has corrected me that he's not principal, he's pro-vice chancellor. I got that information. That's a very good lesson for students. Don't take things off brochures. Anyway, so Hilary holds, and I hope the rest of it is correct, so Hilary holds many senior and distinguished positions in UNESCO, United Nations, in terms of educator, consultant, and advisor. Is that Bob? He's also a distinguished historian and has challenged the government in terms of its attitude to apology and, in fact, its attitude to reparation. Now, and that which I would now call the Cameron effect. And what we hope is that the work he's done and the work that some of his colleagues have done will, in fact, eventually end with, in fact, some sort of recognition in terms of the fact that whilst Britain gained an infrastructure, which, in fact, today, sits here today, the Caribbean countries did not, in fact, they were not given that infrastructure, and that's part of our problem. And therefore, reparation, part of it, is to address that issue. Because the building you're sitting in today, just to put that in context, the building you're sitting in today, and I've checked that. In 1750, Dr. Archibald Kerr sold 39 of his slaves for £220. You're talking about more than $500,000, more than that. And he donated the money to build this building. So you're sitting in your own money, those of you who are from the Caribbean. Thank you very much. Say hello.
Thank you so much, Sir Geoff. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I apologize for not being able to be a part of this conference from the outset. To come towards the end, I feel rather embarrassed by it. And, so please forgive me, but it's good to be here nonetheless. I've been asked to speak on the text of my recent book on reparatory justice in the Caribbean context of Britain's Black Debt, and to use the subject as the frame of this conversation. I'm going to go right in and say to you that in the Caribbean, I think it's fair to say that we have more or less made up our minds that Britain has a case to answer. It has taken arguably 200 years to arrive at this position. There have been decades of conversations from the end of slavery right through to the present time. And after 200 years of civil society discussion and debates, I think we are more or less settled now around the position that there is a case to answer, and that we will proceed with that case in one way or another. governments of the region finally come on board. Historically, governments have kept away from reparatory justice conversations. And I think you know why. Most European governments in the post-independence period have been living in a state of ideological intimidation in respect to Britain. And I think after 40, 50 years of independence, governments are finally finding their voice. I think civil society has pushed these arguments over time, and what we have seen in the last 2 to 3 years is that governments have finally come on board. It is not fair to say that they are comfortably on board. Some of them still have the jitters. But most of them have recognized that civil society has moved the conversation so far along, and that organized government is lagging behind public consciousness. And this is an effort, I think, on the part of governments to catch up with their citizens on this very important discussion. The point has been made that governments have sought to take possession of this discourse. As the chairman of the Reparations Commission, I would say not. I would say that governments have been brought screaming into the center of this debate. The reluctance was endemic, but I believe that public consciousness, should I soften? Okay, so yes, so we have converged. I think there's consensus in the region that we will proceed using, in the first instance, all of the channels of diplomacy that are available to governments to pursue this case, with an understanding that if diplomacy does not work, then the legal channels will have to be pursued. That is the understanding that has emerged out of intergovernmental conversations and discussions with the Commission. There is, of course, a preference for reconciliation discussions around this matter. There are views, of course, that are articulated that, governments are not prepared anywhere in the Western world to engage their post-colonial societies on historical crimes against humanity, and that strategic paths have to be pursued in respect of this matter to the International Court of Justice. Why is it that it has taken so long? In 1938, Sir Arthur Lewis, you all know Sir Arthur, the great Caribbean Nobel laureate economist, distinguished as perhaps a neoliberal intellectual, but in his younger years, radical progressive socialist. And the very first of the many books he wrote, the very first book he wrote, 1930, was a small little pamphlet called Labor in the West Indies. And in this book, he is responding to the state of labor rebellions that have swept through the Caribbean. From 1933 through 38, there are labor rebellions, anti-colonial rebellions, anti-imperial rebellions, anti-British rebellions right across the Caribbean. Almost every island was swept up in this spate of popular protests and unrest. And after Lewis, young man, he might have just graduated from LSE, I think it was. There was a small pamphlet entitled Labor in the West Indies. And towards the end of this pamphlet, he states, after 200 years of unpaid slave labor in the Caribbean is yet to be addressed. The issue of 200 years of unpaid slave labor in the Caribbean is yet to be addressed. He was writing against the background not only of the anti-colonial movement, but it was also the centenary of the abolition of British slavery in the Caribbean. And the rebellions were timed to coincide with the conversations in the Caribbean, 100 years of emancipation. And the black community, again, had converged around the view that in the 100 years since the abolition of slavery, that the material and social and political conditions have not improved. And this 100 years of what we call in the Caribbean, this 100 years of apartheid that was put in place in the Caribbean after the 300 years of slavery, many of the indices of human well-being indicated that, in fact, the conditions for the black community had deteriorated. So the question therefore was, how could the Caribbean have spoken about reparatory justice when 100 years of apartheid have replaced the 300 years of slavery, and when the British state, having dismantled the slavery mechanism, have replaced it with racial apartheid? Even as a child, when I was growing up in Barbados in the 60s, there were still segregated communities. There were communities where black people could not go. The island was segregated. Most Caribbean societies were segregated. 130 years after emancipation. The reparations conversation started once again aggressively in the aftermath of the rebellions, so that by the 1940s, many social movements, led primarily by the Rastafari, had placed reparatory justice at the center of public concern. In those conversations in the 1940s, 50s, post-war period, all eyes were then focused on the political regime Britain had placed in the Caribbean to replace the slavery system. And when we examined the 100 years of emancipation, again, in almost every island in the Caribbean, there were major political rebellions against British apartheid. These rebellions were crushed by force of arms. The British government was sending the troops would come in, they would massacre people. Just a week or so ago, there was a major dramatization of the 1865 massacre in Jamaica, when the ex-slave or the ex-enslaved African population, suffering increasing malnutrition, rising infant mortality rate, growth of social distress, the free population moved onto abandoned lands, lands that were constitutionally owned by the government. These were called crown lands. These were lands that the British state has said belong to the state. The result was a horrendous massacre of Jamaican laborers. The government of Jamaica carried out the instructions from the White House and the event is best described as massacre. That was just one of many circumstances that had developed across the Caribbean in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery, which focuses attention upon what was the intention of the British government in ending the slavery system. The intention certainly was not the liberation of black folks. Had that been the intention, they would not have put a system of apartheid in place. They would not have maintained monopoly control of all the resources. They would not have disenfranchised the community. They would not have increased the militancy of the presence on the islands. Most societies were now built with garrisons, and the militarization of the Caribbean in the aftermath of the emancipation sent a very clear message as to what the intention of the British government was. So, by the 60s, when the independence process is now galloping, and popular unrest is demanding a break with Britain, the leaders of the independence movement did not place the issue of reparations on the agenda. There was silence around reparatory justice at that moment. And none of the nationalist leaders who brought the independence to the Caribbean islands foregrounded the issue of reparatory. The gentleman who spoke to me a few months ago said he is a friend of Dudley Thompson, who was one of the great nationalists of the Caribbean movement of Jamaica, Pan-Africanist, advisor to Kenyatta, support of the Mau Mau movement, but brilliant Jamaican lawyer. I interviewed him about this process. He was very close to the Jamaica process, the Barbados and Guyana process. And he said the best way to describe the independence debates and conversations, he says the best language to use, he says, I want you to imagine a wife who has been brutalized by her husband for 30 years. And she wants to get away from the tyrant. All she wants to do is to get away from the tyrant. And in her flight from the tyrant, her mental construct is, I don't want any of the resources. I just want my freedom. I just want my freedom. I want to get away. I don't want to look back. I just want out of here. So she gets her freedom. She celebrates her freedom and consigns her children to a life of poverty. Because she does not go to a lawyer and say, the wealth that we had accumulated collectively, I wish a fair share of this jointly accumulated wealth for myself and my children, our children. She wants her freedom, she wants her freedom. The husband goes away, he carries everything with him, he gets married again, Britain joins the European Union. He finds a new partner, and he says, oh, that is old history, it's in the past, get over it, I'm going to get back. And the wife is there with her children and living in the home. And that, he says, is a metaphor for the independence. What happened at the independence? that the leaders did not say to Britain, you have extracted the wealth of these islands for 300 years, it's the end of a narrative, it's the end of a conversation, we're now moving in different directions. We need a development plan for these islands, we need to put some resources back into these islands. You have a moral, ethical, and legal obligation to fix the problem, the mess you have left behind, this horrendous mess you have left behind. You need to play a part in helping the young and emerging nations to settle this issue. And it was a total mess. If you consider Jamaica, the largest of the English-speaking islands. Britain took possession of Jamaica in 1655. Jamaica became independent in 1962. In 1962, 80% of all the black people in Jamaica are illiterate. Half of them are classified as in a state of ill health. And then you say to a young nation of 2 million people, 80% illiterate, and you say, go away and develop. Go and develop. No infrastructure, one hospital for 2 million people, a few schools here and there for the elite. The masses of people are living in ghettos, in the cities, the towns, and in the rural villages that are impoverished. The land is owned by minorities, and you say go and develop now. Of course, Jamaica did exceptionally well. The horrendous cards they had to play, Jamaica still did very well to build a viable nation, and to have built viable nations out of the colonial rubble is a great achievement for Caribbean governments. And I believe that, on balance, Caribbean peoples have done very well to construct sustainable nations out of this colonial mess. And so, it is now that 2 generations have come on board since the colonial period, that this conversation is gathering. It is the children of the woman, the children of the mother who just wanted her freedom and did not negotiate an appropriate separation. These are the children who are now saying, hold on a second, hold on here a minute. Something smells here. We want to reopen that negotiation. We want to reopen that negotiation. Something is wrong here. The perception that Britain had committed these crimes and left this mess behind and has walked away smiling and thinking, phew, that was close. And they have sneaked away lovely through the door, you know. And they think, well, we've gotten away spots-free. We've gotten away spots-free. And it would have been the second time that they had done this. But this is what power does. The first time would have been the emancipation conversation. You know, when I was a schoolboy, we celebrated emancipation and the language of the Emancipation Act. Now, I'm referring to when I was a schoolboy in Britain, not in Barbados. I came to live in this country when I was 13 years old. I went to high school in Birmingham City. And in my high school in Birmingham City, we celebrated the Emancipation Act in our history classes. But from time to time, being curious, you would go and read it for yourself. And you would read the fine print. And I was always haunted by the fine print of the Emancipation Act. We are going to free 800,000 enslaved Africans. We are going to pay reparations to the owners of these enslaved people. But the only way we are going to pay property compensation to the enslavers is for one arm of the government to instruct the other arm of the government to pay. But what you're paying is property compensation. So the Act had to first of all recognize that black people were not human and property. So that was the first thing the British government had to do. Had to legislate that black people were not human beings, were property, because that was the assumption that was necessary in order to pay the property compensation. That you're taking someone's property away from them, the state has to compensate for loss of property. So embedded in that act was the British Parliament agreeing that the subject of the conversation were property, and this was not a discourse about humanity, this is a conversation about property, appropriation, and compensation. I used to worry about that, and I couldn't figure out why that part of the conversation was kept hush. Then you go a little deeper, and you realize that in most parliaments, when members are sitting to debate and discuss, in most cases they are playing to the gallery. Rhetoric and broad philosophical statements, all the usual dramatic stuff that you would expect in the heated discourse. If you want to find the truth, you go into the committees. Because the Parliament is going to establish the committees to do the detailed work behind the rhetoric. So behind all of the grandstanding, you have committees that go away and do the analysis. 800,000 African folks. Committees place a value on them of £47 million. So, all the enslaved black folks in the Caribbean and beyond are valued at £47 million, and this is considered to be a significant amount of value. And this is the age, this is the 1830s, this is the age of every guy on the street corner wants to be an economist. Everyone is writing economic pamphlets, everyone's an economist, anyone who can speak in public is an economist, and economists are everywhere. Everywhere over Britain, everyone's an economist. And they're saying you cannot dispose of value. This is accumulated economic value, has to be protected, has to be respected, has to be transferred and accounted for. We have folks in the Caribbean and they're worth 47 million. If you want to emancipate them, how are we going to treat with this value? So the British government decided the taxpayers will pay 20 million of that. So the taxpayers will pay 20 million of this value to the slave owners. But the remaining 27 million has to be accounted for. You can't write it off. For our colleagues here who are accountants, you have a concept called impairment. No impairment. This has to be accounted for, and it has to be paid. And so the Emancipation Act was structured in such a way that the enslaved, after they were freed, would have to pay the 27 million themselves. So they would have to work for free for the former owners. Now they're free until they work off that 27 million. But if you read the parliamentary conversation, it speaks glowingly of a process called the apprenticeship system. That after slavery, we have something called the apprenticeship. And the apprenticeship is a wonderful construct where the formerly enslaved people had to learn how to become wage workers. And the slave owners had to learn how to become wage employers. And this was a period of transition where both parties had to become accustomed to to the market economy and the use of wages. In fact, what the committees have said, that the former slaves have to pay $27 million of value. So the 47 will be accounted for by the taxpayers of Britain will pay 20, the black people would pay 27. And therefore, our ancestors had to pay more than 50% of the cost of their freedom. And so, when we were told that Wilberforce and all the great emancipations liberated the Caribbean folk, yes, good legislation, but the slaves themselves, the ex-slaves, the enslaved people had to pay over 50% of their own emancipation. They had to work it off, and they didn't. That was the first coup that the British government pulled on the Caribbean. First. The second was the independence. Take it and go away. No development, no compensation. Take it and go. That was the second. Now, if you read the secret correspondence of the colonial governments, because you know in those days the governor of each colony would send a monthly report back to 10 Downing Street. And his monthly report, or the monthly report, would contain information about the state of the colonies. By the 60s, those official secret reports, which are now available to the public, I should say, at the time secret, now open to the public. We need to make arrangements to give these Caribbean islands their independence at minimum cost, no cost to the British taxpayer. We need to get away from this. The world has changed. We need to slip away and leave these colonies behind. That's the language. That's the language you will find in the secret correspondence of the governors to 10 Downing Street. So all of this came to a head in 2001 at the Durban UN Conference on Race and Xenophobia. I was busy in my class, minding my own business, received a phone call from the Prime Minister saying that I had to lead the Barbados delegation to Durban. And the position of the Barbados government is that the item of reparatory justice has to be on the agenda. And that was my remit. I arrived in Durban with that remit. Most of the other delegates from the other islands, and there were 8 islands represented, also had a similar remit. We arrived in Durban. The Americans had said that if reparations is on the agenda, they're out of here. They didn't come. And this has something to do with race, but not much. Something to do with race, not exclusively. Because remember, it was Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice who had said that we're not discussing reparations. Okay?
Yeah, true.
So, okay. And remember that in Durban, the British delegation was led by Baroness Amos, who sat across the round table from me and presented the British position. Britain had done nothing wrong. Slavery was legal. We had made it legal. Britain will not apologize. No crimes were committed. No reparations were paid. no discussion around reparations. So I am the coordinator of the Caribbean delegation because the other 7 countries have asked me to coordinate the Caribbean perspective and to negotiate on their behalf with the European governments. So Condoleezza Rice has said she wasn't coming, and I am engaging her in this Amos. You might very well say it's a black triangle that was at work here. So this is politics. And this is politics at the highest level.
Yeah.
The Caribbean folks were united around this. We recognized that we had to hold the center. The Africans were divided. Or I should say, the Africans in the Caribbean were united, the Africans in Africa were divided.
Yeah.
Some of the African countries have said they were going to stand with the Caribbean and the diaspora. Others said that they would not. And there were always secret conversations. Some of the countries were saying, well, you know, we are currently negotiating major loans with the World Bank. We are negotiating major loans with the World Bank. We are under IMF surveillance. We can't afford to rock the boat because if we stand with you, Britain and the European countries will sabotage our loan prospects at the World Bank, IMF. And so we have to put our citizens first, so we back in the way. Of course, our response has to be, we fully understand. We fully understand. We put your citizens first priority. So the African nations were divided on this. The South African government, the host, was in a very difficult circumstance because this is post-Mandela. Clearly, Mr. Mandela is keeping a very close eye on this. President Mbeki is keeping a close eye on it. They don't wish this first global conference to collapse in their country, not good for the world, that the whole world has assembled in South Africa in the decade after Mandela, and there is so much hostility. So the horse trading started, that the Caribbean ought to back down. Latin America and most of Asia have said, okay, to allow the conference to go ahead, we will take reparations off the agenda. So the Caribbean was surrounded by organized international power. We took a decision that chattel slavery, as the world came to know what chattel slavery was, started in the Caribbean. Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, the sugar plantation economy started, Barbados becomes the first society in the New World with an African majority. The first place in the Americas where Africans outnumbered everyone else. Barbados was where all of this started. First chattel slave system. The first economy entirely built upon and dependent upon chattel slavery to survive. This is where it started, and I am from Barbados. And hell if I was going to betray that legacy. So we dug in. We dug in. And took a decision that if the conference collapses, it's going to collapse. But we are not going to betray the history and experiences of African folks in the country. We said that. And I want you to imagine the pressure, because in these international conferences, you don't sleep. sometimes wonder if you don't sleep because they want to make you tired and you make mistakes. But you don't sleep. So at 3 o'clock you get a phone call. You need to meet with the president at 3:30. And it's 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. Your eyes are red and you can't think clearly and you have these important meetings. When we were sent for by the heads of the European delegations to be pressured to remove reparations off the agenda, Dudley Thompson, his name Dudley Thompson, who was, as I said before, an architect of the Molvo struggle. He was a Jamaican who was Kenyatta's advisor and who was an architect of the military strategy in Kenya among the Molvo. I am not going to mess with a man like that. And he called me and he said, if you go into that room and betray the Caribbean peoples, don't return to the Caribbean. And remember that in Jamaica and West Kingston, Dudley Thompson was an MP for West Kingston. And his nickname was the Burning Spear. That was his name, the Burning Spear. So we dug in, and the conference proceeded on the basis that it will be discussed. But they agreed we were voted to put a bracket around it. And when you bracket a concept, that means that you can debate it under the custom rule. You can have a debate, but it is only rhetorical. That the outcome of the debate is not binding. And that was the basis on which we proceeded. I want you to imagine a conference in which you are seated alphabetically. And I am sandwiched between Arafat and Castro. And Arafat is whispering, there has to be justice. And Castro is whispering, there will be justice. And that is how we were supported. Now I want to say this because some African countries, Zimbabwe made a very interesting statement in the plenary. Zimbabwe said, in our darkest hour, that we were fighting the apartheid Smith regime and we were revolutionaries in the bush fighting for freedom and justice. It was Bob Marley's music that kept us going. And we were in the bush, fighting for our lives. The South African army was supporting the Ian Smith army. And these revolutionaries were sustaining their spirits with Caribbean music. Well, man, we are going to liberate that. So the Caribbean was in the middle of this struggle. And because of that, he said, we are standing with the Caribbean. And Mugabe has sent that message to Durban to tell the folks down there, we are standing with the Caribbean. So all of that was important. Now, and this is where, as academics, all of us come into this. The British delegation was enforced and buttressed with a cadre of scholars. So the Baroness and her team come in to do battle. We went to discuss reparatory justice. Other countries came with different agendas, but the British delegation was made up with some pretty heavy intellectual ammunition. Historians, parents, yes, historians, philosophers, lawyers, psychologists, the whole interdisciplinary barrage of intellectual thought and experience in order to establish the legitimacy of slavery. That was the purpose of that scholastic group, to establish Britain's position that Britain had done nothing wrong, slavery was no crime against humanity, slavery was legal, the slave trade was legal, everyone was doing it, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And there was a fair amount of hatred in that plenary. Now, you might find it difficult to imagine. I want to capture for you the best I can the hatred which was experienced in that room. It was as if we from the Caribbean had committed a crime. To come into an international forum to discuss justice and to experience hatred, to feel the palpability of the hatred in the air. You know, there was a moment in which I thought, this feels like Mississippi in the 1950s. If they could put a rope around my neck, they would. But that's how it felt in there. It was not collegial. And it certainly was not intellectual. It was bitter. It was extremely bitter. By the way, I came back from that conference and gave a lecture, a public lecture in Beckles, and I had a debrief, and I said, the world is in a very terrible state. Because the hatred that was experienced in that conference around this subject, I said, the world is filled with hatred. The world is in a very bad emotional state. Something terrible is going to happen in this world. Shortly thereafter, 9/11 New York. I could feel it. So, it is all about power and what power does when it can and when it can get away with it. It's all about power. It was sad to me that those British intellectuals who have surrounded their state, it was sad to me that British jurisprudence had fallen into an unethical pit. It was sad to me that British historians could put their intellectual capacity at the service of illicit interests. I felt that it was a clear example of scholarship for the highest bidder. And mobilize to protect organized power. I was not told in graduate school that that was the purpose of my discipline. I was told in graduate school I was being trained to be an academic scholar, to pursue lofty human objectives, to place humanity at the center of your mind, the preservation of the human species as the ultimate goal, the pursuit of human happiness, and stability and sustainability of civilization. That was what we were told. We were not told that we had to defend criminal behavior. But that is what we saw. There were moments when it all got rather personal. And reparatory justice, in the end, is a personal story. It's about how each individual is prepared to internalize the historical legacy and how that interpretation will shape your behavior going forward. It's all about that. It's all about movements and governments and big struggles. It's about individuals taking responsibility for their past, the past of their societies, how they have collectively benefited from a certain kind of historical process. I have personal stories to share with you. I grew up as a child, I was born and raised on a sugar plantation that was owned by the Cumberbatch family. Now, of course, we're all very proud that young Benedict Cumberbatch has become a great actor. I think he's one of the finest actors in the world. I marvel at his skill. But I was born and raised on his family sugar plantation. And it was interesting that a plantation should produce an actor and an academic. So he and I are bound together by a common history. My grandmother who raised me, her name is Adriana Cumberbatch. So my maternal side is Cumberbatch. The women in my family worked on Benedict's family sugar plantation. It could be that we got the name Cumberbatch because we were their slaves and we took the names of our slave owners. Or it could be that we are biologically related. Either way, I do not know. I have no interest in finding this. But it is striking that young Cumberbatch, brilliant global actor, has not been back to the site of the place that produced his family's wealth. He has not been to Barbados, back to his family's sugar plantation, which they owned for 200 years. He got a great education. His family became very wealthy. They all became very rich. He's become a brilliant actor, all the best that money could buy, out of their plantation in Barbados, on which I was born. Then there is also the case of Lord Harewood, who owned the plantation that my father's father worked on, Turner Hall Plantation in Barbados. The Harewoods came out to Barbados in the 1640s. Upper working class, lower middle class family. 100 years later, they are part of the British aristocracy. One of the wealthiest families in this country out of Barbados River. 1922, they marry into the royal family. Lord Harewood marries Princess Mary. From poor white to slaveocracy, to plantocracy, to aristocracy, and finally to royalty. And when I met the Earl of Harewood, he came to Barbados 2 years ago, and we met. We had lunch. It was a wonderful conversation. Great guy. It was the first time he had ever been to Barbados. At the time, I guess he was probably in his late 40s, early 50s maybe, and had never been to Barbados. The place that had produced all of the wealth for his family. Launched them into meteoric launch into Mars, into Buckingham Palace. You would imagine that as a young man, you'd be curious, no? Where did all this come from? You know, I want to go to the site where all of this happened. I have no interest. So, what you're speaking about is that not only the British government has said, we are turning our back and moving on. That is what Cameron told the Jamaican Parliament. But it's what individuals have all done. It's what Benedict and his family have done. It's what Lord Harewood has done. They have all said it. We are not looking back. We are turning our backs on the place and the people that gave us all of the wealth and the authority and the prestige to live the good life. That is the point. And what is peculiar to the Cumberbatches and the Edinburghs is common across Britain. The British are quite comfortable to go to the Caribbean and enjoy the beaches. But don't show us the plantations. The plantations are on the inside of the islands. We will stay on the perimeter. Enjoy the beaches, drink the rum. Best rum in the world, enjoy it. Not quite. I'll give a plug now. I will say right now, the best rum, Guyanese rum. Personal choice. But that is how it is. Now, where are we at the moment? There is still a sense in the region of being intimidated. The governments have banded together. And the reason the governments have banded together, because they're all aware that left standing alone, Britain will intimidate them, threaten them, and force them into reversal. So they've opted to band together. Why should governments be intimidated to call for reparations? Why should Caribbean governments be intimidated to say to Britain, you need to acknowledge criminal wrongdoing, you need to acknowledge this, you need to apologize to these people whose ancestors you have enslaved, but you need to come and speak to these people about the future. I would imagine, were I a British Prime Minister, and I'm looking at the long 21st century, there's a long century ahead of me, and it's going to be a great century. Lots of young people doing great things with the whole internet technology. Young people are remaking the world. The 21st century is going to be a great world for young people. The world is getting rid of many of these. A lot of the hatred of the world is dissipating. The world is very fashion. Well, I, a leader, I'll be saying, I want to inscribe myself into this future. I want to be on the progressive side of history. I would want to be on the side of a world that young people would enjoy. I wouldn't wish my citizens to be carrying this weight. I would wish to help to alleviate this. I would want to say, let us have a conversation about this past. Let us reshape the future. Let us rebuild the relationship on different principles of integrity. Let us allow the suspicion and the hatred to dissipate. But then again, I'm an idealist. I believe that academics ought to be idealists. Because I believe our job is to imagine a better world and to always be imagining a better world. Because the reparatory justice movement is going to be the largest political movement of this 21st century. It's not going to go away. It's going to spread from country to country, continent, all those parts of the world that have had their citizens enslaved, genocide off the planet, colonized, resources appropriated for the benefit of the West. All of those countries, one by one, in time, are going to join this movement for justice. It is going to happen. It's inevitable. It's inevitable that this is going to happen. So, why not engage it constructively? Why not try to shape it? Why not try to manage it in an orderly fashion? The fact is that all of those contradictions of the Enlightenment have been exposed. All of those contradictions. I mean, when I was at university here, I had to write essays on John Locke. Locke on liberty. All of you had to write essays on Locke on liberty. We all had to write political philosophy classes. We all had to write essays on Locke. But you had to go to the archives to find out that John Locke was a slave owner in the Caribbean. You had to go to the archives to find out that John Locke was the corporate secretary of the Royal African Company that was mandated by the King of England to sell 6,000 Africans in the Caribbean per year. But it was easy. Locke would have said, he would have said in his own way, I am not willing within my conceptual sphere of liberty and freedom. So all of these contradictions, all of these delusions are being exposed. And monuments have fallen. Lots of Western monuments have fallen. Prime Minister Cameron says we shouldn't waste our time talking about the past. I did a study of the British budget for the last 2 years. Britain spends £2 billion on historical monuments. It's extraordinary. But he says that to a Jamaican parliament, and no one in the parliament said, the 300,000 monuments of history scattered across Britain that the government protects and refurbishes. What's all that for? What's the reason for all of these historical? Well, just a contradiction. You are the leader of a conservative party, Mr. Cameron. The reason why it's called a conservative party is because the founders of it said that we have to conserve the best of the past. We have to look back because Britain reached its highest level of cultural sophistication in the past. And we have to preserve the best of the past and bring it for the future. The past is our mantra, take it into the future. So when he says to us, forget the past, we want to say, but we are conservatives too. So, and as conservatives, we want to conserve. So, I'm going to end it here by saying this. I live in Jamaica now, and it's interesting moving from Barbados to Birmingham to Jamaica. It's the triangle. Britain imported some 1.3 million Africans into Jamaica. Jamaica was its largest and most profitable economy. 1.3 million Africans shipped into Jamaica between the 1655 and 1807. And at the end of slavery in 1838, there were only 300,000 left. How do you bring 1.3 million people into an island? And after 200 years, only 25% of them have survived. 25% survival. You have a 75% attrition. How do you explain that? It's genocide.
Yeah,
It's genocide.
that's right.
If you put 1.3 million people on an island and after 200 years you have 25% of them left behind, that is genocide. There's no other language to describe that. Anytime you render a people incapable of reproducing themselves by imposing on them a work regime, a cultural regime, a political regime, a military regime, and you decimate them, it's genocide. So in the Caribbean, we don't just speak about slavery. In our language, slavery and genocide go hand in hand. Africans in Barbados. 600,000 Africans were brought onto the island of Barbados. At the end of slavery, there were 83,000 remaining. The population of Barbados today is 280,000. Today, 280,000. And 600,000 were brought onto the island. Over 200 years. From island to island, the British slave owners, and that includes the British government, because don't always bear in mind the government was also the owner of slaves. No. Don't think it's just private citizens.
Sure.
The state itself, the system of the state, owned slaves, managed slaves, bought and sold. Government did that. From island to island, what we saw implemented by British slave owners, whether in their private or public capacity, was a process of genocide. So these are the historical circumstances that are driving this narrative. And so when the younger people of the region, the younger people who have now said, this history must be discussed. It has to be discussed in an organized fashion. There has to be a conversation. And what they really want in the Caribbean, they want a conversation with British young people. This is what they really want. They want an inter-youth conversation about this 21st century. It is no good saying to the Caribbean youth, we like your music, but we don't like your history. If you're going to sit with the same folks and enjoy their music and their rum and their culture, you have to be holistic in that perception and talk about everything. Because what it is, it's the culture that binds you together. I was very clear on this for my own personal journey. I arrived in this country at the age of 13, straight from a Caribbean sugar plantation. Direct descendant of this, direct. But felt at home in Birmingham. Felt at home. Why? Because all of the people who ran the city, all the big names of Birmingham City, I knew those names in Barbados. These were the people who had owned the plantations in Barbados. And now they own the factories in England. They were the same people. They were the same people. So it was not an international journey. Do not mind what the immigration department said. If you move from Barbados to Birmingham, it's an internal journey. It's entirely internal. Because you're dealing with the same people and the same process, the same culture. We are preparing Professor Shepherd from the Jamaican Reparations Commission, the chairman. We are organizing a Caribbean reparations rally. We're going to start from one end of the Caribbean, and we're going to move a baton from island to island. And wherever we stop, we're going to have a roots rock reggae concert. And we're going to move from island to island, and the whole world will see that the Caribbean is united around historical justice. We've given all of you early notice, all of the things that come and support the Caribbean Reparations Movement. The Caribbean Reparations Movement is the British Reparations Movement. Do not allow special interest groups to deflect you from doing the right thing. When Mr. Cameron knew he was wrong. But guess what? If there was a moment of doubt and ambivalence in the Caribbean, when Cameron spoke, it disappeared. Thank him. Thank him for uniting us in a way that we couldn't have in mind. So, but then again, probably when, you know, as historians, we all believe in the power of dialectics. Something goes wrong, and you think, oh my God, it's all wrong, then just all of a sudden steady. It's dialectical. The other side is going to come around just the opposite way to come. So we had 2 or 3 days of vexation. And after the 3 days of vexation, then this emergence of groundswell of opinion. So we thank him for that. So we are going to extend an invitation to all of you to join the Caribbean and the global reparatory justice movement. This is our world. If we are going to all go and live on Mars or Jupiter or where have we in the next couple of years, let us fix this one first. Let us live on this one comfortably. Let us take this greatest crime that has ever been committed upon our planet. 500 years of genocide. The greatest crime the world has ever seen. Let us heal it. Let us acknowledge it. Heal it. And build for the future. I thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, wasn't that something? I think it's a very good reason why you shouldn't educate black people. Because you'll have a problem. What I mean, it is because black people have taken this history up themselves. And I've got Eric Graham sitting here who's got a story. And part of that story is that because black people have taken up this history, we've got white Scottish story have now come on board. Because what they wrote in the 70s was incomplete. For example, one of our historians wrote a book on the tobacco roars, and I think slavery isn't mentioned in the text. I did point out to him, I thought the tobaccos were worth one. So what we have, what Sir Hilary has done, is actually told us tonight in no uncertain terms that language, which is very important. The problem is with academic, as we all know, we often try to say things as nicely as possible. And I think that is what has delayed this movement for so long. And what Sir Hilary has done is actually told us as it is. And I would like to congratulate you again on what you've done with that. One of the points he made, and because I'm Jamaican and I've done a little bit of work in this area myself, what he was talking about was the Morant Bay Rebellion, which is exactly 150 years this year. And in that rebellion, it was Bogle and Bowden, and we're in Scotland now, and those are Scottish surnames. It was Bogle and Bowden who decided to take the British government to task in Jamaica, 150 years ago, on the basis that they wrote to the governor to say the way they were living was not acceptable post-slavery.
And to Queen Victoria.
And to Queen Victoria. And she wrote back and says, get on with it.
Yeah.
Your work.
Work hard.
Work hard. And therefore, what those two guys did, they did what Professor Beckles is doing. If in fact you have a problem, you've got to try and address it. They did it in a military way and they were hanged. The interesting thing, Charles Dickens supported the government against them. So don't trust the white intellectual. Because they are dangerous. Because they are the people whom you were dealing with in the conferences, who in fact was playing the party line. So don't trust a little twist. It's a twist. However, what I'd like to do now is to open up the meeting to questions. Can I just take that one first? All right, then. You're closer. And you know where I live.
Go on then.
You mentioned that Britain did a job on the Africans in the Caribbean or Western by first they had to pay for 50% of their freedom, and also come independence, they let them lose without any development. But there's also another crime that was committed after the Africans had worked for their freedom. And when the time comes for them to get paid, what the British did was brought in people from India to undermine them. So I'm stealing that.
That's a fair point. The Africans fought to end slavery, and they did. In some places, they succeeded completely. In Haiti, they built a state. The Haitian people have not received the credit for this. For building the first nation in the modern world entirely on the basis of human freedom. No other society had ever achieved that. We owe the Haitian a debt of gratitude for the conception of universal freedom. The Americans won the independence from Britain and built an independent nation on the basis of slavery. Had to go back to the battlefield to resolve it. Civil War. The British, having restructured the slavery system, and I do not like to use the word emancipation in the context of British legislation. It was a restructuring of slavery to create terms and conditions of slavery by another name. The African people had a problem with some of the relationships, and to sustain their long-term interests, they brought in marginalized, exploited workers from India to fill the breach. And bear in mind, by this time, Britain had also colonized India. So the British colonization of India was unshackling and releasing Indian workers from their land. They had done it in Ireland. They had unshackled the Irish worker from the land and left them to flee to the world to make a living. It was interesting to note that it is now agreed that the potato famines of the 1840s were manufactured by British policy.
Right.
But they wanted cheap labor to build the railway network. And the thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of British railways were built by the Irish, who were disenfranchised in their own land, free, cheap labor. So they brought the Indians of the Caribbean to do the work that the blacks had been doing. Pitting two groups of colonized people against each other. We are now trying to resolve that problem. Antipathy, but the African and the Indian people tried their best to manage a horrendous divide and rule situation. They had shaped Caribbean life. So yes, that was a part of the history, and I would argue, in support of you, that had it been the intention of the British state, having abolished the legal infrastructure of slavery, to then empower the enslaved people to become citizens and participate in the normal development, they would not have brought 1 million Indians from India's goods. But it was meant to release them into freedom, undermine their economic potential, and leave them to starve. So when you hear of the Morris Bay crisis in Jamaica, 2 generations after emancipation, and people are starving. They don't have any land. The land belongs to the slave owners who held on to it. And they're free but starving. And if you're free and starving, then you squat on land. You go and find whatever piece of land you could find and plant crops. You plant food. If you plant food, the government comes in and says, hey, that's his government land, get off. You say, but I'm starving. Soldiers come in and shoot you down. That is the world that was put in the Caribbean after emancipation. It speaks to the ignoble thinking of a significant section of the parliamentarians. But let me say this, having said that, men like Thomas Buxton, I'm a great admirer of Buxton. I think he was a nobleman. Compensate the slave owners. You have to compensate the slaves. And when he stood in this parliament and said you need to compensate the slaves, they laughed him out of parliament. But he kept his integrity. On these days, they're going to put a monument to Buxton in the He was a great man. And when the reparatory justice movement gains traction, I know that some of those remarkable men and women in the British Parliament, that small minority of remarkable men and women in the British Parliament and around the Parliament, the various movements, we will honor and we will celebrate them because they were the ones who placed it on the agenda in this country that reparatory justice is necessary.
Yes. Just before you begin, before you start, I've just written a scientific paper and it's dedicated, it's on barley and on beer, and it's dedicated to Buxton. Buxton was a brewer, and Wilberforce chose him because he had morality, power, and money. And Buxton delivered a good intellect. So I know a lot about Buxton, but nobody does. But he was the one who delivered slavery in 1830.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for coming in. It's a wonderful presentation. My name is Hilary. I'm about to the Reparation March committee. Language March, 1st of August here. I'm coming from a slightly different perspective on this. And I do admire all the work's being done in the Caribbean. I'm the descendant from the Caribbean as well. For me, the African personality in the Caribbean has been distorted. It's as if we've been stripped of our African mind through our enslavement, our names, our language, our custom, our tradition. That part of the repairing process, I'm interested in how we can get that process going in the Caribbean, within the school system, within the homes, within the communities, particularly with renaming ourselves as a people carrying killers as our last name, murderers and rapists as our last names. I find that very painful for me as an African. So I'm saying that as African countries in the Caribbean, can there be some commitment on those agendas? Because it's never done after emancipation. It's never done independence, so-called independence. That commitment to re-Africanize the population in the Caribbean. Let me go further and say that our towns is named after these killers. Our parishes, our cities, our roads, our schools, our hospitals. You know, these are things that we don't need permission to do.
That's right.
From no British government, and I know we're going to need money, but we're going to come to help do some of this stuff. But we need some renaming ceremonies in the Caribbean.
That's right.
We need to restore the African personality. That thing has been severely damaged by the enslavement of our people. Now, I know the academic achievement is great, but we are academically Eurocentric. So that part of it, if you can speak to that for me, sir, and see what can we do on those fronts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Because that is the heart. That's the heart of the matter. And you move from the individual to the structure. I carry the name Beckles. At the end of slavery in Barbados, the largest slave owner in the group family was the Beckles family. John Beckles and his two sons, Henry and George, were among the largest slave owners in the island. So, comes emancipation, all the enslaved people took the names of their slave owners because they had no other. I feel that pain. Each time I ride through my island and I see all the plantations that were owned by the Beckles clan, I cringe. So I know what to speak of. The cultural dimensions of slavery or enslavement and the genocide of it is a subject that has not been even marginally penetrated. The cultural eradication that took place on those plantations. Most of us are now speaking English, and most of the English people have difficulty understanding our Caribbean English because we did not learn English from the English, we learned English from the Irish. The English owned the plantations, but the Irish were the managers and the overseers. So the Africans actually learned English from the Irish and the Scots. I mean, the English owned the plantations, they were absentee, they were high and mighty, they lived in the house, but it was the Irishmen and the Scots who were the managers and the overseers giving instructions, and the first time they heard English was from the Irish and the Scots. This is why the Jamaicans have a very interesting accent. There's a lot of Irish in there. There's a lot of Irish in there. All the men in my family, their middle name is MacDonald. I don't know where that comes from. My father, my grandfather, all the men named MacDonald because of this Scottish. This Scottish slave owning. The community in Barbados where I was born is called the Scotland District. Scotland District. MacDonald, the Scotland District. So, the cultural eradication, where after 100 years people were completely stripped of everything. There is a discourse, of course, that says the process was not complete. Maybe 80% eradication, like 90%. But that is the pain of it. That black people in the Caribbean are without a known ancestry. You take it for granted that you could go to an archive somewhere and trace your family's history and you could check with your family. Black folks in the Caribbean, you go back, maybe their grandparents out and they get some work. No records. So you are removed from historical record. An entire mass of people removed from historical record. That is cultural genocide as well. To be stripped from living down like that. When I was in high school in Birmingham, the schools in the city used to take the children on summer tours. So the kids in Birmingham would go to see the Acropolis, go on these summer tours and go to Greece and see the Pantheon and the Acropolis, and then they would go to Rome and see the Colosseum, and they were told, go and learn the roots of your European civilization. And the kids were socialized into knowing the roots of their Western European culture. Which Caribbean kid knows anything about Africa? It's completely stripped of their past, no connection. So, in the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice, one of the items in there is called the African Knowledge Network. All the Caribbean schools ought to be partnered with schools in Africa, partnered with high schools in Africa, and in the summer, these kids move around between schools and reconnect to their past. In much the same way that kids in England do it. go across the continent in the summer and learn their culture. These kids in the Caribbean need to know CARICOM and reconnect to their past. These kids are politics are part of the party. But it's a huge conversation. Thank you.
Yes, I thought of it, and thank you for the presentation. And probably also the launch committee with the African Emancipation Day, Reparations March. I've got a different aspect about the whole thing.
Fine.
I tend to adhere to the Native Americans' philosophy that the white man speaks before time. He never keeps a promise. And but I'll add to that, he speaks from a position of power. He does what he does because he can do it. There's no opposition, there's nobody to stop him from doing it. He will come and speak to you and give the impression that he's speaking to you nicely. If you don't listen, he flies a few planes over you, drops some bombs, put you in your place. Yeah? I hear the legal argument, I hear about going to the courts. I mean, this is their courts. This is their courts. I think that what we do as African people is that we've forgotten that traditional African mentality that you plan 7 years ahead. We need to plan 700 years ahead. We need to plan 100 years ahead. I used it as an explanation, when the Chinese was colonized by the various European countries, and at the time Britain was at their height and the sun wouldn't set on the British Empire, and they leased Hong Kong for 99 years. At that time, the Chinese weren't no power to really resist them. But the Chinaman who was leasing it wasn't leasing it for himself. He knew that he gave himself 99 years to take back his land. And when he moved in with the Red Army, what could the British say in the 90s? They couldn't say nothing. Because militarily, if you want to go with us, there's 1.5 billion of us, you got nukes, we got nukes, let's nuke each other and see who lasts. Simple. Yeah? Deterrent. So, my question to you is, Elder, do you really think that we are going to get reparatory justice from a European system that was created? And remember this, everybody in the room, that they said it was lawful at that time. This is the requisite that they're using. That it was lawful. Is it a fidel law? Yeah, for white people, it's their law. Yeah? It was fidel law. So do you really think, Elder, that we're going to get reparatory justice from them people? Okay. Let's
leave it at one. That's a big one.
Yeah. So we don't know the answer that. I mean, you know the answer still, but I just wonder why you
You're a very good lawyer, because lawyers are told never ask a question unless you know the answer. Well, there's something called the politics of doubt. And there is doubt about reparations. There's doubt. And there's a politics of doubt. Go back to 1820. Do you believe that in 1820, the 800,000 enslaved Africans believed that freedom was going to come? No. I think if you did a survey 1820 across the enslaved population, they have been enslaved for 300 years. You can't imagine 300 years. But they heard there's a conversation taking place in the parliament in Britain. There's a war in Jamaica, 1831. There's a war in Barbados, 1816. There's a war in Guyana, 1823. Island after island is going up in warfare. But you believe that despite all of those rebellions and wars, that the average black folk in the Caribbean in 1820, 1830 felt that the whole thing was going to be dismantled? I don't think so. Okay. I think there would be doubt. There would be doubt.
I disagree.
Okay.
And you got Haiti, 4.
Yeah, all of that. Still doubt. Fast forward another 150 years. When the independence conversations came up, all of the Caribbean leaders, premiers, not yet prime ministers, premiers, each one said, if we put independence to referendum, we're going to lose. If we put independence to vote, we have been colonials for 500 years, and if you put the issue of their independence to referendum, they were going to lose. And all the leaders, Buster Manley, Norman Manley, Eric Williams, Falls Burnham, D.C. Bird, they all said, we cannot go to referendum. We're going to lose. The black folks in the Caribbean will vote to remain colonials. So we have to disrupt. And that's why all the countries in the Caribbean became independent without a referendum. Because the people were afraid of stepping into this unknown. I'm not speaking of the Scottish referendum. I'm speaking of the Caribbean. I'm not speaking of Scotland, I'm speaking of Caribbean. Now, so we come now to the next seminal moment. There was the slavery moment, emancipation, there was doubt, there was the independence, and now we come to the reparatory justice. I believe that the vast majority of Caribbean black folks do not believe that they will see reparatory justice in their life. I believe that's the view. But what we do know about our history.
You're going to see a black president in the United States.
They couldn't see that one coming either. They wouldn't have seen that one coming. The Germans didn't imagine that they would see the Berlin Wall fall in their lifetime.
That's right.
They couldn't imagine that either. So what our history teaches us is that you're always surrounded by popular doubt, but then the minority moves, and the minority in short time becomes the majority. That is the dialectic we have to learn. So in the midst of doubt, the minority moves. The minority convinces the majority somehow, somewhere that this is necessary. And before you know it, the ground shifts and the world changes.
Don't put God.
So yes, I think that we are in the state of doubt. But that doubt should not be seen as a passion. It is a moment, and it can change with flash.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, go. Okay.
Oh, okay, yeah, may I?
Yeah.
I've lived here now for 38 years, and my daughter was my wonderful uncle for 4 years.
Can you speak up? I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I'm pensioner.
Speak louder.
I'll try. I was making the point that in your very excellent book of history of Barbados, I came across a name, John Shannon, an Irishman, who happened to be my godfather. And he was very involved in assisting and guiding many of the prominent Springer politicians of that era towards helping black people to vote votes during the struggle of the 30s. So I thank you for that. That is a little bit of I won't even look further as we discussed earlier. But my double question is as follows, and I don't expect answers tonight. The church, number one, I feel very passionately that the church had a terrible role to play in all of this, with blotting our people's attitudes and mindset. And secondly, if we are going to make this certain thrust about reparation, and I don't think I'll see in my lifetime, but I certainly think my grandchildren will too if they return to Barbados. I sincerely hope that we will put into play these business magnates that have made so much out of us as countries and people. And very often it's only the political realm that we hear about as opposed to the role that business had to play, taking livelihood consequences on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. The Irish were an important part of Barbados history, as were the Scots an important part of Jamaican history. The engineering of nation building, very complicated indeed, and at independence in Barbados, the majority of white folks, whose families have been there for 200 years, packed up and emigrated. They could not imagine that they could live under black government. And they emigrated to South Africa, where they could continue in the apartheid world. Thousands of them went to South Africa. Many went to Australia, where they could practice their racism. some into Canada. So there was a 50% collapse of the white population in Barbados after independence. Within 15, 20 years, they were all back. They were all back because they went out into the world and realized that they had this funny accent and they couldn't fit in. They were struggling to fit in. And they realized they had to come back and find a way to become a part of a nation. One of the challenges that we are facing in the Caribbean is how to integrate all of the ethnic groups into a multicultural, multiracial sensibility about nation building on the premises of fundamental equality. It's a challenge that all post-colonial societies have. It requires engineering, that citizenship has to be reconstructed. And the circumstances in South Africa today, very similar to what the Caribbean went through in the 70s and 80s. How to get this right. Not easy. But culture is also important. Culture is important. And after 300 years in the Caribbean, they're Caribbean people. And they're digging in now, I think they're now beginning to understand that they're Caribbean folks and they must have a national sense of that. So things are changing slowly.
And I'm Professor Beckles, thanks very much for your lecture this evening. Before I go any further, allow me to just say that I cannot allow us to suffer the myth that the so-called black president, i.e. Barack Obama, is in any way, shape, or form a historical victory for African people in America or anywhere in the world. We as a people must stop falling for symbolism without substance. Look at the facts. African people in America,
in prison,
socioeconomically are much worse off under Barack Obama.
And in prison.
Whilst Europeans are better off. The prison population of African people has gone up under Barack Obama. And now we have this Black Lives Matter movement where Africans are screaming for their humanity to be validated because the state is shooting our people down like wild dogs on the street. So why are we celebrating Barack Obama as a historical victory? I don't understand it. And we must stop it. This is why the world does not take us seriously.
No one else is.
They play all Barack Obama is, let's use a slavery analysis. He is the black man in whose hand the white enslaver has put the whip to lash the rest of us. That's who he is.
Say that.
That is who he is. Now that was not the point I originally wanted to make when I did that. But I had to respond to that. I'm very sorry.
You have a right to
I beg your indulgence. I beg your indulgence. I do have a couple of points. I'll try and be very, very quick.
Yeah, because we've only got one or two questions left.
I understand.
Only two.
There are issues in relation to the Caribbean Reparations Commission and the CARICOM government that need discussion. I will not raise it here and now. And I don't believe that this is the forum that I would want to raise the issues, very serious issues, that need to be discussed, and we need to discuss them as an African family. But I will touch on the points that my brother raised here, which I'm not sure we have addressed, which is that there are things that we can do in the context of self-repair, like, for instance, renaming some of our towns and cities, tearing down some of the monuments that were built to celebrate enslavers and colonizers. Caribbean governments can do that. And the Caribbean Reparations Commission should take that issue up and should be challenging our governments to start making moves on that.
Now, very quickly, 10 line word. Very quickly. I'm not taking over your thing, but I just want to say very quickly. What's his name? The Prime Minister of this country. Cameron. That's it. When David Cameron goes to Jamaica and claims that reparations is not a valid demand, and that not only is it not a valid demand, but Britain played such a fantastic role in ending, what do you call it, the so-called slave trade, and fighting to end the slave trade. Let's be clear. David Cameron is behaving like a pimp who has waxed himself rich from prostituting and brutalizing women on the streets.
Yes.
And with his ill-gotten gains, now invests, quote unquote, in a brothel where he can carry out his dirty deeds, but now wages war on his former fellow pimps who are still carrying on the so-called trade on the streets to protect his brothel. That's a more appropriate analysis about Britain and the so-called abolition of the slave trade. I wish I had time to develop on that. But Britain is perpetrating a fraud when they keep flagging up this nonsense about Britain having abolished the so-called slave trade. And
right.
finally, and I'll sit down.
Okay.
Finally, my final point, and I'll sit down.
Yeah.
Yeah. You made reference, Professor Beckles. You used an analogy of us being the children of the mother who now wants their freedom and who is, campaigning for that freedom and for some money to go with it. I want to suggest that our relationship with Britain is more like a stepchild with a wicked stepmother who killed the mother of the children, tricked the father into marriage, then kill him, and then commandeer the children's the inheritance. And then they came into consciousness about what this wicked woman did. And now they are fighting her for their due inheritance. Thank you.
Professor Beckles will give an answer because we've got two other people and I want to be fair. We should be out, actually, of the building. So, okay, very quick.
After 300 years, I think we will give
Okay.
The questions you have raised are very important and must be answered, I think, clearly. The Barack point, I think it's a viable argument, but I believe there are other arguments. I think there are other ways to look at it. I think Barack's success is, I think it's a little more than symbolism. I happen to have been in the US observing that campaign. My niece managed his campaign in Ohio and is now one of his executive assistants in the White House. Now, my niece is no superficial young gal, tough as nails. She managed that Ohio campaign. As you know, Ohio is a battleground state. They were able to mobilize the imagination of young people. They were able to mobilize the imagination of young people, white Jews, all kinds of people to imagine something different. And I believe that what the young people of America were imagining with him, and the way they surrounded him, the way they voted him in there was integrity in that. I believe there was integrity in that. But you are right, the corporate sector that is Republican, redneck, racist, that group fought and launched a counterattack. They launched a counterattack, circumscribe him, demean him, reduce him, embarrass him, humiliate him. But I believe that what you saw and how he has handled that, humiliation, the non-legitimization of his right to be there, I think he handled that with African finesse. And I like that about him. It is possible to say that the role that white global corporate capital has assigned to black leaders is to be some kind of moral conscience. They have asked Martin Luther King to be the conscience of the world. They have asked Nelson Mandela to be the conscience of the world. And they are assigning to our people a hyper-morality where we have to rise up above all the things and see the bigger picture, and that is the role that has been assigned now. I can see the problem where you were trying to identify, but I think Wheelock is a little more complicated, and it doesn't fall nicely into the Lackey Stooge symbolism, but it sweeps out of there. Because again and again, wherever he goes, and I have been in his company on 2 occasions, and I see young people in America, the young people in America, they love him. And they are looking to him to show them the way. I think that's real, my friend. I think it's real. And I believe that...
That's perception.
That's a perception, brother.
I think it's a desire. It's desire.
Based on a perception.
A perception of what they want to imagine for the future. Now, in relation to the question about the second part was focusing on betterment and change. Well, one of the things that we learn from history again is that progressive change and accomplishment are always fraught with setbacks and fragmentation. The generation of free black folks after emancipation were worse off materially than the generation of slaves. Now, when you do the demographics, the first generation of free black folks were worse off materially than the last generation of slaves. Because the white people said, okay, you're free off my land. Go and survive off my land. This is my land that they have been working on for 300 years. Off. Go and leave the house, get out, go. And they were turned into vagrants. So people who had been living in villages as enslaved people were suddenly turned into vagrants. Now, infant mortality went through the roof. The babies began to die. Life expectancy came down. All of the indicators went in the wrong direction. But those folks did not say, let us go back. They didn't say, let's go back. They said, despite whatever is happening here, it's going from bad to worse, but better must come. And that has always been the vision of black folks, that better will come now. When you adopt the philosophy that better will come, you're doing that knowing that all around you is chaos and treachery. And it's not easy. I mean, it's not easy. Each time I go into New York and I walk the streets, one of the images that always come to me is Malcolm X standing on that podium, speaking. And 3 young black brothers come up and riddle him with bullets. that haunts me every time I go to New York. So we're always surrounded by, and that is the legacy of the slavery, the self-destruction and the self-mutilization. This is a very complicated part.
Those were government agents, I think.
It's a system. The system.
Those were government agents.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're always surrounded by it. Every step we take, we are surrounded by treachery. It's always the case. Treachery on the outside, treachery on the inside, and that is why my brother, slavery lasts for 500 years.
Europe.
Because despite our greatest efforts to uproot it, you're fighting the military capacity of your enslaver, and you're fighting the internal divisions of self. It's very complicated. So, what you described, my friend, I fully accept, but I'm saying there are also some other ideas you put on the table alongside that, and that will give, I think, a more complete picture.
Could I have one question for somebody who's not asked one from that young man, that young lady there? We have no lady from women. Can we have a question? Could you speak up?
No, I'm very honest.
They say stand up, man.
Don't tell her what to do.
Very inspiring and empowering. When Cameron went to Jamaica, we were following him here, and the work of both Professor Green and you was very, very encouraging. And what you said has had a huge impact on what is going on here in the UK. I have to agree with Brother Van Decker about Baracko's anthem, because I think it's deceitful for us to perpetuate a narrative which is actually a lie. The reality is not what's perpetuated.
That's right.
I respect him as an individual, but I think Brother Van Decker is correct. Now, my point about cultural reparations, cultural genocide, and the thinking about going to Africa in order to regain identity, culture, narrative, and all the rest of it. I think it's very important that as a second generation person from the continent, I know for a fact that the minds of those who were left behind have been colonized.
Yes.
So the education system is no different from here.
Yes.
Stuff, the values, so languages we have, names we have, but the real cultural reparation needs to happen for those on the continent as much as those who were stolen.
That's right, sister. Thank you.
I need to address the issue of the name, and this is so important. But I will give you an example of what could happen. Until last year, when I was the principal of the Barbados campus of UWI, we launched a campaign to do exactly what you described. Now listen to this story very quickly. Nelson Mandela is coming out of imprisonment. The students on the island organized a massive rally to welcome Nelson back to the world. The physical world. Not this, the physical world. And in the middle of the celebration, 40,000 young people rise up in celebration of Nelson in a public park. They passed a resolution that the park should be renamed the Nelson Mandela Freedom. The current name of the park is Farley Hill Park. It was a park that was built on a slave plantation by a gentleman called Mr. Briggs, and he is from a village in Ireland called Farley Hill. And he names his slave plantation after the village in Ireland where he came from. That was 200 years ago. It is now a public park. So we asked for the park to be renamed from Farley Hill to Nelson Mandela. The black community said this is a noble thing, it's the right thing. The white community on the island rose up in indignation, launched a campaign and said, you are removing our history from our island. You are erasing white history. You are moving from one form of fascism to another. You are involved in cultural erasure. You are rendering white history subordinate. And you are laying the foundation for racial strength. The white community launched that campaign, and they launched it very aggressively because they owned the newspapers and they owned the corporations. The government that had agreed to the renaming back down. So you saw power mobilized on this landscape of culture. But there is a Parliament Park. But there is one on Nelson Mandela Park. And where? On the university campus. Because that is the one place they can. So now the university campus has a Nelson Mandela Park. Because this is the one space that is available to you to do with as you wish. So believe me, the challenge is real. And the gentleman who spoke about the CARICOM Reparations Commission, let me say it. It's a government commission. Notwithstanding the fact that many of us are on it, we have all different types of people on this commission. All different types of people. Grassroots people, academics, NGO people, all kinds of people are on this commission. But it is a government commission. And we are aware of its limits. I do not believe that the CARICOM Reparations Commission is at the heart of the struggle. It is not at the heart of the struggle. It is just an element of many other elements in this struggle. And I will not be a part of any rationale that says the CARICOM Reparations Commission is in the vanguard of reparations. It is not. It is just a strategy developed at a moment in time to move the conversation along a little. But it is not the heart of the struggle, and can never be. It's a civil society struggle. The commission is just an instrument, moving it from A to B, hoping that it adds value. But believe me, it is not at the center. So, yes, it has advantages, but we who are on it are fully aware of its many disadvantages. And the criticisms of it are real and legitimate. From time to time, the prime ministers remind us that we cannot step outside the crease. We are a government commission.
Right.
They remind us of that. So believe me, there's a tension there. So the critique, I'm happy to hear it, because I tell you, we have to keep the civil society movement going. And if we think for a moment that the CARICOM Government Commission is going to hold this together, it cannot. It is just an instrument of many other elements in the process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is it. We have been Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. And would you give? Before you go, what I'd like to say, we've heard a wonderful lecture, wonderful responses. But as a scientist, if you're going to effect a change, you have to develop a viable strategy. A viable strategy. And the other final point is the majority is usually wrong.
Can I just say that a lot of you are going for dinner at the conference in Salisbury Green, but anyone else, you are very warmly invited for a glass or two of wine upstairs. It's in the adjacent building. So there is a reception. Don't think there's dinner, but we have to
Beautiful.